Hello guys, welcome to Dr. Science. So today our topic is about hormone response elements. Unfortunately, this diagram is taken from Harper's biochemistry, and this is a very complex diagram. I was not able to understand during my MBBS days, but I will try to make it easy for you guys. Okay. First, in order to understand the hormone response elements, we have to draw a small diagram here. So this is the cell, and this cell is going to have some receptors which are present on the surface, and these types of receptors are called as your extracellular receptors. Similarly, the cell have receptors in the cytoplasm, and these types of receptors which are freely floating in the cytoplasm of the cell are called as your cytoplasmic receptors. And not only that, inside the cell we have the nucleus. On the nucleus also we have receptors. Now these types of receptors are called as your nuclear receptors. Now imagine there is a ligand, and this ligand is going to act on the extracellular receptor. The ligand, or imagine there is a hormone. This hormone is going to act on the extracellular receptor. Now that type of receptors, that type of hormones which act on the extracellular receptors are known as your group 2 hormones. So basically group 2 hormones act on your extracellular receptors. Whereas there are hormones which can act on your cytoplasmic receptor, or the hormone can act upon the nuclear receptors. Now these kind of hormones which act on the cytoplasmic receptor or the nuclear receptor are called as your group 1 hormones. Okay, so basically in conclusion, stimulus is of two types. One is mediated by group 1 hormones, and other is mediated by via group 2 hormones. Group 1 hormones mainly act on the cytoplasmic receptors or the nuclear receptors. Whereas group 2 hormones, they act on the extracellular receptors. So first, in this topic, the main important thing is your group 1 hormones which act on the cytoplasmic receptors. So first we will talk about the cytoplasmic receptors. Keep the heading cytoplasmic receptors. So once again we will draw the diagram here. This is the cell, and the receptor is present in the cytoplasm. We'll draw it here. So the receptor is placed in the cytoplasm. Now there is a hormone called as your glucocorticoid. There is a hormone called as your glucocorticoid. Now this hormone is a lipophilic substance. Lipophilic means it is lipid loving, so it can freely pass through the plasma membrane. So once it passes freely through the plasma membrane, it will go and attach to the cytoplasmic receptor. Okay, so the glucocorticoid is going to bind with the cytoplasmic receptor. Instead of calling it a hormone, I will call it as a ligand now. This ligand, which is a glucocorticoid, is going to bind with the cytoplasmic receptor. Okay, so what is happening, we will try to understand by drawing a diagram here. So this was the cytoplasmic receptor, right? And this is a ligand. This is the ligand, and this one was the cytoplasmic receptor. So this cytoplasmic receptor is unfortunately bound with a protein called as your heat shock protein. Okay, so whenever this receptor is bound to the heat shock protein, it is not activated. It means it is most of the time inactive. But when the ligand, such as the glucocorticoid, comes and binds with the receptor, this heat shock protein, which is known as your heat shock protein 19, is going to dissociate, is going to come off. Heat shock protein 19 will come off from the cytoplasmic receptor, and the cytoplasmic receptor and the ligand, the entire complex is called as your ligand receptor complex is formed. Okay, so once again, whenever the ligand comes and binds with the receptor, the heat shock protein is going to come out, and eventually it will form a complex known as your ligand receptor complex. Now what is this step called? This step is called as your activation reaction, since the receptor is getting activated by removing the heat shock protein. That's why it's called as your activation reaction. Now there is formation of the ligand receptor complex. Okay, now once the ligand receptor complex is formed, it should go to the nucleus. So the ligand receptor complex will go and fuse with the nucleus. Here is the receptor and here is the nucleus. So we have to understand what is happening in the nucleus now. So we will draw the nucleus diagram here. So this is the nucleus. Now inside the nucleus we have DNA, right? Inside the nucleus we have the DNA, and this DNA, there is a DNA sequence. Now this DNA sequence which is having high affinity for glucocorticoid, okay, so this DNA sequence is having high affinity for the glucocorticoid. So obviously these high affinity DNA sequence are called as your hormone response elements. So what is meant by a hormone response element? It is nothing but a DNA sequence which is present in the nucleus, and it is having high affinity for certain hormones such as glucocorticoids. If the hormone is glucocorticoid, then the sequence will be glucocorticoid response element. If the hormone is thyroid or retinoid, then the DNA sequence can be called as your thyroid response element. And similarly, if it is retinoid, it is called as your retinoic acid response elements. So hormone response elements is nothing but a specific DNA sequence which is having high affinity for that hormone. Okay, I hope you are clear with the hormone response element. Now I talked only about the cytoplasmic receptors. Now we will talk about the nuclear receptors. Nuclear receptors, compared to the cytoplasmic receptors, work in a different way. Okay, so once again we will draw the cell here. I already talked about the cytoplasmic receptors. Now we will talk about the nuclear receptors. So these nuclear receptors are completely different from the receptors such as your cytoplasmic receptors. For example, we will take a hormone such as your thyroid hormone, or we can take another example which is your retinoic acid. Okay, thyroid or retinoid, they directly go and bind to this nuclear receptor. Okay, thyroid or retinoid are the hormones which go and directly bind with the nuclear receptors. These are also a group 2 receptors, group 2 hormones. Okay, I mean group 1 hormones. So how is this different from the cytoplasmic receptor? We have to understand. So we will draw the nucleus separately so you guys will understand. So this is the nucleus. Okay, this is the nucleus. Oh my god. Okay, we'll draw it. Okay. So here is your nucleus, and I already told you thyroid is going to act on the nuclear receptor. So here is the nuclear receptor, and unfortunately the thyroid is going to bind with the nuclear receptor. When this binding is going to happen, usually there is this DNA sequence present inside the nucleus, and this DNA sequence is known as your thyroid response element, which is having high affinity for the thyroid hormone. So unfortunately this thyroid response element is bound with the repressor protein. What is this? This is a repressor protein. And whenever this repressor protein is associated is attached to the thyroid response element, it cannot go forward direction. Okay, I will draw it here once again. So this is the thyroid response element, which is having the DNA sequence, and this DNA sequence, this thyroid response element is going to have a repressor protein which is repressing the gene. So eventually what will happen, the thyroid ligand, the thyroid hormone comes and binds with the thyroid response element, and this repressor protein is ejected out. Repressor protein is thrown out. Okay, so once the repressor protein is thrown out, the thyroid response element will get activated, and this activation requires certain types of proteins, and these proteins which are going to attach to your thyroid repressor TRE is your activators. So once again, when thyroid molecule is going to come and attach to the thyroid response element, it will eject the repressor protein outside, and once the repressor protein is outside, the activator protein will come and bind to the thyroid response element, and once the thyroid response element is completely activated, it will start the transcription or translation. Okay, so that's why the nuclear receptors act in a different way compared to the cytoplasmic receptors. Now finally we have the let's draw it with, okay, finally we have the extracellular receptors. Now these extracellular receptors act mainly by G protein coupled receptors. So usually the hormone could be anything such as your epinephrine, norepinephrine, acetylcholine, like that. So these types of hormones are called as your group 2 hormones, which act by binding to the extracellular receptor. So that was about hormone response elements. Thank you guys.